Good afternoon, Sid, if you're there.
Hi. And there's Deb.
There we go. Well, listening to the podcast he recommended this morning,
Oh.
and it was pretty interesting.
I still get confused with my right and left on Zoom. Because
you look at yourself as a mirror. You're looking at a mirror image of yourself.
I'm not. No, I'm not looking at.
Actually, there is something you can toggle back and forth between them.
Yeah, but I'm not looking at a mirror, and that is what confuses me. And in fact, if I look up, I can see myself in a mirror, and everything is.
That's a little too much cognitive overload for me.
This is my right hand, but it's on the left side of the screen, and this gets screwed up when I talk to students. Because I never know my right from my left anyway.
Well, this is my right hand also.
Right, and it's on the left side of the screen.
Right.
But when you look in the mirror, your right hand is on the right side of the screen.
No. When you look in a mirror, your right hand's on the left side. Oh no, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Wait, is he left or is he right?
You are correct. So I was
thinking about movies and people moving screen right and screen left, and it just gets all. all mixed up.
So, everyone doing okay today?
So far,
All right. Oh, I have to make sure the internet is aimed at this computer in my house and not elsewhere. So give me one moment to make sure that you have my internet's priority in addition to mine. And
I just started reading Michelle Goldberg's column in today's Times, which is about the Mike Haley, the new head of labor. And but I'm not sure where she's going with that column.
is if I understood correctly, there's some accusations of anti-Semitism
That is what's today.
against the nominee, but I've read from Jewish sources that they are false accusations or making a lot out of nothing. I'm not sure which. I didn't get to delve into it. So last class, we tried to get into a lot of different issues, both in terms of American politics, Jewish politics, politics in Israel a little less so, but definitely the kind of interplay between what happens in Israel or is done by the state of Israel, the government of Israel, and how that might affect Jewish identity or identity politics here. And I suggested two potential ways of working to bridge, I guess, the American Jewish divide or the Jewish American divide. One is to use Brandeis's sensibility that both for peoplehood in terms of safety and for our social justice and moral leadership, to see being Zionist as being a way of being good Americans. And I guess the question is, how much of both do we need to be doing? Or is it at this point that America and the Jewish community in America is so divided that we're choosing one of those two, but not the other, which causes some division? Or using Michal Biton's identity politics as a way of understanding that we all should appreciate each other's multiple identities and loyalties, not get bogged down into dual loyalty accusations, certainly against each other, and see where that has us land for her. I mean, not going to the Second Women's March, but also not divorcing herself from the women's movement, and asking that the Jewish people of color who are making a high priority of being part of that march to continue to press some of the leadership for more repair with the Jewish community over their connections and support of Louis Farrakhan. Right, so two models that we're kind of holding out as potential ways of bridging some of the American Jewish divide, maybe applicable to the Jewish people as a whole in Israel and in America. And today, we're supposed to put that behind us a little bit and think about new ways to use metaphor to tell a story that might help us come together as a Jewish people, across the globe. I will tell you that I was disappointed by the lectures, to say that they offer less in the way of possible solutions and more opportunities for thinking differently And we're going to have to do the play. We're going to have to see what of the different metaphors appeals to us and works for us, starting with where is that model coming from, what are its either limitations or possibilities, and potentially even redefining it. So the first thing we'll do is kind of look at a series of just defining terms. I'm using slides developed by someone at the Hartman Institute, so I have to go through each one. It'll look like a lot of slides, but there's not much on each. And then we're going to get into the first model, which is the family model. And we're going to contrast it with the consumer model. So these are sort of polar opposites. There's some other models in the middle. And I'm going to add a layer to the material that was in the source book and in the lectures about loving rebuke, to see if that can give us potentially a little bit more wiggle room. And then we'll move on to shared believers, not spending a ton of time on it, but
Uh-oh, I think he got frozen.
You're frozen. Can't hear.
Yeah. The frozen shows. Okay, man.
Give him a minute. He'll probably have to go out and come back in again.
Yeah.
I'm back. Are you good? Yes. Okay. So now I have to share screen again. I changed a couple devices and hopefully that'll help too. Okay. So I lost you somewhere between loving rebuke and shared believers. So loving rebuke is not in the materials, but I added it because it was teased in the interviews. Am I still with you? Are we good? Oh, okay. Shared believers gets a little bit of short shrift in the lectures, but again, in my Hartman faculty source material, there's a way in which we can use that not just to talk about ancient sources, but also Zionism. And so that might be helpful to us. And she also, my source, went on to look at partnership outside the context of the materials, but fully within the Hartman Institute, going back to David Hartman and his book, Heart of Many Rooms, to see if there's something we might tease out there. Time permitting, I'm going to come back to this whole issue of Brandeis and Beethoven as possibilities to see if these new metaphors help us, pick up one of those or just a third rail that maybe we could use. But we're gonna have to see how we do on time. And nothing in the identity politics thing is new. So here we go. If I can get it to move. All right, and I'm sorry to say that next week is our last class. So here we are, models to consider, and then March 13th at Homeness. I will tell you, I have an idea that I'll run past you for what we might do after Passover. Okay, so in your source book, Daniel Hartman lays out these different metaphors and terms. The family model, right? A family is a group of people related by blood and having a shared sense of belonging and mutual obligation, which is a little different than fellow believers. So family is supposed to be that kind of like the Judaism of being, and fellow believers is the Judaism of becoming. It's a group of people who have a strong commitment to shared religious belief or a belief that, something is right or good. Both of those are in contrast to a partnership model where a group of people join in common understanding and they share in the risks and also in the rewards, the profits. Contrast partner with investor, and there it's a collective enterprise where one group is spending money or capital or resources with the expectation of profit or gain, but it usually, as we're going to get into, it has a hierarchical relationship with the investee. So we have family and fellow believers as these sort of like tight models, partnership and investor as a kind of temporary arrangement. It could be long-term, but it's not necessarily long-term. And consumer as a kind of very contemporary model. It's where you purchase or you benefit from, using certain goods or services, right? You're expecting an outcome for whatever your expenditure is. We're going to get into each of these, but that's how he lays out the groundwork. And thankfully, we have more to go on. So we're going to color code it: blue, green, orange, purple, red. I don't know why they're out of rainbow order, but they are. And here we go. Blue, family. Going back to week 2, it's an involuntary relationship. You inherit it. You're born a Jew, right? You can join, like by marriage or by conversion. But really, it's this sense of like, we are a family just by virtue of, sort of given circumstances. And therefore, we have a kind of unconditional mutual obligation and loyalty. And again, that unconditional piece is like more about unconditional ties as opposed to the obligation being unconditional. We might, place certain obligations on certain groups, right? But like the tie is unconditional. And the other thing about family is this becomes a primary source of identity. Usually, your national identity or some other identity you might wear as like a profession comes after you've been rooted in a family. And that makes exiting very difficult, right? You can leave your family, but that's, a very big deal. And going back to like, the chosen, it's a source of mourning and grief for your family if you leave. Contrast it again with the Judaism of becoming, which is more about belief and story, common mission, common cause, and then it becomes about the cause and less about the actual people. And you can exit when you believe the mission is no longer shared or potentially not compelling or not relevant, right? But typically, this is not on the slide, but typically your commitment is actually stronger because of the shared belief, right? Not only is it that you're trying to do something together, but because it inspires you and is the form of connection that while you're doing that work, you have a tighter relationship than you might with family, because like some family you're closer with than other family members. Okay, partners. We already went through some of this. The idea, though, is a partner is there in good times and bad times, right? So a partner, unlike an investor, isn't just going to take their money away, because of a short-term dip in the market. Like a partner is there to help you fix whatever it is in your company, or in your efforts. So you can exit, yes, but not at will. You have to have a conversation. It's a little bit more complicated. And you would only do so, again, when the partnership's not shared, when you fully disagree with the other partner, or the other person is acting in bad faith. Investor, same thing as before, but here we have the power imbalance being sort of clearly labeled out. There's a core asymmetry between the one investing capital and one receiving the investment. Very interesting moment in the 2010s, the early 2010s, when Netanyahu, maybe it was as early as 2008 or 2009, but somewhere right around 2010, Netanyahu had the Jewish agency basically say to America in particular, we don't need your money. We could do this work on our own, right? So invest in what's going to help us do extra, but don't think of us as the needy receiver of your charity. It was a big moment in American and Israeli relationships. And I think we're still feeling out some of what's now the case. And the rest of this, I think we already said, because the investor can exit at any choice, either because of unacceptable losses or, if they just want out. Last one, consumer, right? We expend capital to achieve benefits, and exit simple, just I'm disappointed, or I don't want the product anymore. I'm just, and this is the sort of instead of going and joining a different synagogue, it's just like dropping membership. Ugh, do I say that? Right. So unfortunately, the more the consumer model dominates, it in many cases, it's not about a loyalty issue where you're going to change loyalty. It's you're just done, and you exit, and that has a lot of negative consequences. The positive is that congregations and other institutions have learned that they have to compete for the consumer, and they want to retain their consumer base, right? And so the quality of our product in theory has gone up. I will tell you, in all of my conversations with Debbie, she's working hard at this. So you've got someone good at Bethel, on the consumer model, as the other models, right, become more complicated. Any question on all of these, as they're delineated? Okay, just a kind of quick poll. Any of these, forget about which one's the most real, which strikes you as having the most potential for bridging, not American Jew to American Jew, right and left, but a North American who cares about Israel, broadly defined as caring, right? And an Israeli Jew, or all of Israeli Jewry and all of American Jewry. What has the most potential for kind of maybe bringing us together?
It seems to me that the shared belief model comes closest, because once you go past that, you're really strictly into transactional relationships, and to me, this has to be something more than just a transactional relationship.
Excellent. And to that end, Neil, what I like about that is, right, even family is not transformational, not necessarily transformational, right? Fellow believers has that opportunity to be transformational as opposed to transactional. So partnership, transactional most of the time, right? Investor, definitely transactional, and consumer, definitely transactional, right? Any Sid, do you want to pipe in?
Oh, I agree. It's funny. I was thinking family or partnership. I mean, family in the metaphoric sense.
Yes. Okay. So
I can't stand you, but you're part of my family.
We're going to talk about that very, and that's why I kind of added to what was provided for us. It feels like Doniel Hartman is focusing on family and consumer because he sees those as dominant narratives, and we're going to talk about that too. But where are the people who get interviewed at the end of the unit 13, so the second to last unit, where Rabbi Kirshner in New Jersey, northern Jersey, and a woman, Techila Eshed, I think, in Israel, where they kind of play out is, how can we use the consumer model to kind of help people be more like family? And how can we use the family model to create, shared belief? And so it's not going to be one of these exclusive of the others, so much as how can we draw on all of these metaphors to see where it might lead us. So let's see what happens. Okay. Again, following this sort of lecture series, the family versus the consumer model. As I was implying, Daniel Hartman feels like these are the two dominant strains. And in particular, he says Israelis expect loyalty from North American Jews because they're stuck on the predominantly family model. He says one community sees Jewishness predominantly in terms of the family model. He means Israel, okay? While the other increasingly adopts a consumerist perspective, which is increasingly the American model. So Israelis are expecting family relations from North Americans, and North Americans are saying like, hey, Israel, like I get something in return for like what I give out in the Jewish community here. Like, again, it's a sense of belonging. It's a sense of opportunities for Jewish education or learning, or I give to the Federation and they do good things in the community, whether it's helping the other agencies, whether, again, yes, schools and synagogues, but certain kinds of programming or funding social services to those in need, right? We have this model of like, our money is going somewhere, and if it's our time, if we're giving of our time, I'm either going to enjoy my class or stop going, right? And want any money back kind of thing. Or if I'm giving my time, then I want to feel like I did some good in the world, either for my fellow congregants, or I'm going to be involved in some kind of social action that has an impact. And so we often expect the same thing of our support for Israel, like, and the place that's like not political for American Jews. It's just so in contrast to the security situation and like what it means for an American Jew to make certain demands of the Israeli government. In contrast to that, what it means that just this past week, conversion by conservative and reform rabbis will be accepted by the state of Israel, not necessarily by the chief rabbanut, for counting as part of the law of return is tremendous. It means that, we're part of Israel. We're part of the Jewish people as Israel defines the Jewish people. That's important. When there was a big agreement between pretty much the reform and conservative movements and the Netanyahu government that we would have space at the Kotel, not on the southern steps, but the actual western side of the Temple Mount, right? To pray in the egalitarian way. And that was revoked. The American Jewish community was really upset, right? Because, we thought we were like, not just family. I mean, it's one thing to be upset with your like sibling or, your parents, or you kind of like, you might hold a grudge for a really long time, but there's still love. This was like, do I even have a place? And so many members of the progressive movements, both in Israel and in North America, took that took that revocation of the policy as a kind of personal statement, and caused some withdrawal. So we have these mismatched models, and then the question is, what do we do about it? So one thing to do about it is to appreciate the positives in each other. So instead of seeing the glass as half empty, right? Whatever we might lose in terms of not treating each other like family, that sort of thickness of identity and the priority of Judaism as like the first thing, we don't take the people we're with for granted, right? Jews who are involved are involved. And part of our involvement means that we're going to demand quality and meaning and purpose. And so our Judaism has far more meaning, and the things we do Jewishly are richer than your typical Israeli Jew who maybe is secular for one thing, and like their idea of Yom Kippur is to ride their bicycle down the main street of the city, right? Like there's a certain beauty in that, but that is far different from understanding the process of tshuva and repentance and making good with your neighbors, than a day of real quiet and many Israelis, particularly in the secular community, feel the lack of meaning in whatever Jewish religious practice they engage in, right? And again, in North America, there's been a number of Jewish communal institutional kind of renaissances, like the vibrancy of the kind of programming, even in COVID, right? Like that Bethel has all these like, baking on Zoom and pick up this party pack or, all the different things. Who knew that we could deliver Judaism the way we have, let alone that there are all these sort of independent, smaller Jewish pseudo organizations, right? Sometimes they're just people meeting in someone's home, kind of like the Chavurah movement of the 60s and 70s, but in whole new ways now that are affecting the institutional landscape. So much so, by the way, that Israelis come to North America to learn how to do Jewish. So like glasses half full. And likewise, North America, again, can learn about that thickness of family relationship of like Judaism coming first from Israel and its loyalty. So as Israelis start to feel the consumerist model, like their startup nation stuff, they, again, while they've been willing to settle for, by services here, they mean like prayer services that they don't find compelling, how are they going to like improve their Jewish lives? Okay, so I want to look a little bit more at the family model because Sid, you were onto something, right? And it's beautiful, I think, and I think it also changes like sort of how we line up these metaphors. So here we go. Do you remember the text way back when? I think it was in week 2, where we pointed out that the tribe of Reuben and Gad, or in part half of Manasseh, didn't want to come over the Jordan River.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? Okay. And what was the stipulation? Like, how did Moses say it's okay?
Join the fight when we
right. When Joshua leads everyone, you have to come battle on behalf of the other tribes. And by the way, that was supposed to stand for any war. So when Joshua finishes conquering Canaan and all the tribes are spreading out, he says, like at the beginning of this chapter, chapter 22, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, you can go back across the river, right? You did your part. Everything's great. And something really interesting happens, which is that the Reubenites, Gadites, and half tribe of Manasseh build an altar. And the rest of Israel freaks out. The other 10.5 tribes are like, you're going to bring a plague upon us. And they send Pinchas, who's like the most dangerous of the Levites, by the way, like just pointing this out, to go investigate, right? And it turns out, this is what happens. They're like, far be it from us. We would never do something like that. And if you see in the, let me back up to, no, I think we'll start with the highlight. Okay, so the 2.5 tribes decided to provide a witness for ourselves by building an altar, not to offer burnt offerings, not for korbanot or other sacrifices, but as a witness between you, the other 10.5 tribes who made it to Canaan, and us, and between the generations to come. They were worried that in future generations, right, the 10.5 tribes would say, you're not really Jewish. And so they built this altar that they would never sacrifice on to say, we are serving the same God and we are so bound together as like the 12 tribes of Israel that we're not going to use this altar. If we're ever going to offer a sacrifice, we're going to go to Shiloh or to Jerusalem or wherever else, right, the different altars that were official would be set up, right? and if you ever came to accuse us, we could show you this never used altar as our symbol of devotion to God, the one God of the Jewish people, and right, this sort of like long-lasting memory, right? And that way the other tribes couldn't say that you have no share in Israel. Family's complicated, right? So thanks for fighting in the war for us. You can go home, and but you can't like put us in danger with God, at least. And it all works out, and everybody's happy, and Pinchas reports back, and they're all like, yay, right? But this was a tense moment of family kind of on the edge. Oh, sorry, there was more to the text. So they would point out the altar that our fathers made as a witness. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord, or to turn away this day from the Lord and build an altar. And then at the bottom, the Israelites were pleased. The Israelites praised God, and they spoke no more of going to war against them to ravage the land in which the Reubenites and Gadites dwelt. That's how bad it was, right? The 10.5 tribes were willing to go to war to wipe out the Reubenites and Gadites and half of Manasseh because of this altar, because they were so worried that this 2.5 tribes had kind of put the other 10.5 at risk. And thankfully, again, no, it's a witness between us. Everything's good. So it begs the sort of like larger issue of how it is that Jews are supposed to relate to each other. And so we have this passage, which is kind of instructive, right? So Hizkiah taught, Israel are scattered sheep, and the question is, why are Jews likened to sheep? So when a sheep that's hurt on its head or some other body part, the whole sheep feels it. I don't know enough about sheep to know if this is true or not, but that's the text. I doubt it. I mean, but that the text says it this way. And it says, so it is with Israel. When one of them sins, everyone feels it. This is the opposite of like, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebaseh. Instead of us all being responsible for one another, it's like, if you get hurt in Rochester, I'm going to feel it in Delaware, right? And they go on to give like a parable, which is really instructive, which is here. In the middle. Shimon ben Bar Yochai taught a parable. Men were on a ship. One of them took a drill, started drilling underneath him, at sea, by the way, right? And they said, "What are you doing?" And he replied, "What do you care? It's under my seat that I'm drilling." And they said to him, "The water is going to rise and flood all of us on the ship, just like it happened to Job and so on." So, right, someone else's sin causes a problem for the rest, and that's what we saw going on with the Israelites and the Reubenites, Gadites, right? Is this transference of sin and the punishment that might come upon us, and it could be as bad as drowning, right? So the question is, without going to war, what should we do about it?
Is this part of the reason we say the al-Chait in the plural?
I'm gonna say yes, but I think the real trick here is,
I know there are other
but to take the question in its sincerity, I think this is why we're supposed to do what I'm gonna say next, which is to stop people in our community from our needing to say the al-Chait in the plural, right? The goal is, like, wouldn't it be nice if the list was completely inaccurate instead of like, oh yeah, I know someone down on the 3 rows up who did something maybe not so good, right? Or in today's world, the person who got arrested and we know what bad they actually did, right? So here, loving rebuke is an interesting piece. So this exact slide I used with you last week, or not last week, but a little while back, to contrast between Achicha, Amitecha, and Bnei Amecha, Barecha. So all these brethren, kinsmen, countrymen, fellow, stranger, citizen, all these different levels. But what I didn't emphasize is the second half of the first verse. Not only should we not hate our brethren, we should reprove or rebuke or admonish, depending on how you translate, but here it's reprove. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. Right, so you got to do something to prevent sin from coming upon you, right? Collectively, and part of that is going to be the rebuke, but also you have to do it in a way that like you don't become associated with the guilt that may have already been there. So here's how it plays out in rabbinic literature. A commentary by the Bechor Shor, 12th century, he says, if your brethren does something that upsets you, don't hate them in your heart. That's the first part of the verse. You should reprove them. That's the second part, which is to say, go over to the person, discuss the matter with them in a respectful manner, and say to them, why did you do this to me? Wait a minute. No one said in the first part of the verse that they did something to you, right? But you should see it that way. You should see someone's actions towards anybody that are, you know, worthy of admonishment as having been done to you. And maybe they never intended like what you had thought. Clearly they weren't thinking about you probably because they were thinking about you, whatever they did, right? They didn't even realize the like communal guilt that might come on them. Or it could be that they couldn't help themselves and they just like, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean it. And they just need a chance to say that, right? They might give you some other explanation. But by doing this rebuke or reproving, this tochecha, which is a mitzvah, you'll come to realize they didn't actually do anything improper to you, right? And you're not going to be, it's maybe it was personal between them and the other person. And it was actually appropriate. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe they have, whatever it is, it's no longer about you because you had the conversation, okay? And you're not walking around mad at them. Clear? Can make it a little more complicated. Oh no, I'm not. I will later. I'm going to come back to this this relationship. So one of the things I want to put out here is like, again, a family model where we are responsible for the behaviors of other members of our family is one that's less familiar to us today, right? And so if we're going to play with these metaphors, we should understand that like Jewishly, there was a time in which it meant that. And it feels like sometimes Israel understands that about American Jews, that we feel guilty of something that Israel does, right? Even if Israel's doing it for proper, quote unquote, self-defense or for a reasonable cause, or maybe they, you know, it wasn't supposed to be about us, but it was really about Iran, right? Or I don't know. I'm not excusing the Netanyahu government of anything, but right, having the conversation in a way that is family, loving rebuke is very different than screaming in the press and writing op-eds and, you know, right, left, back and forth. Got it? Okay. So let's go back to the shared believers that Neil thought might have a lot of potential. And here, where I want you to think not just of like, you know, a helpful metaphor for us maybe is Thanksgiving, like when you have extended family together. And like, look, there are some members of the family you only see at special occasions, bar mitzvahs, weddings, God forbid, funerals, and something like Thanksgiving. And so there has to be something that draws everyone together. And like, probably you're gonna be on your best behavior at dinner, but sometimes you just don't know what's happened in the past year. And maybe you haven't gotten along with that family member for forever. So you come in kind of feeling about it. But Thanksgiving dinner is also the time when the young people start to bring their significant others, and you're creating new extended family. So how do we bring, you know, people who either aren't with us enough during the year into this sort of like sense of sharing, or someone new who's going to be close to us into an understanding of what we do? I'll say this to the two of you because I'm imagining you're kind of these people that like you don't show up just on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah to services. So, you know, when you see all the people who only show up then, like, do they know what Bethel's really like? Do they, you know, like, and when they look around the room, are they looking for people like you, or are they looking, you know, who are they looking for? How do we make that all work, right? And what kind of pressure is Rabbi Bitran under to like make them feel as at home as you might feel, right? Very tricky. So we looked at this text. Oh, I lost Neil. We looked at this text before. I'm just emphasizing again at the bottom this bit about Abraham not only bringing his personal family, Sarai, and his nephew. Hi, Neil, you're back. Okay. We've seen this text before. I'm just emphasizing the bottom that Abraham and Sarah, or Avram and Sarai, they amassed not just wealth, but other persons before they, you know, left Haran and set out for Canaan. So what's that all about? Who are those people? And, you know, are they part of the, when we say like, we're the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like Abraham had other people besides Isaac who were Jewish by this verse, right? And so Rambam brings us an interesting kind of like rule, which is really just stories. And he goes back to this sense that if you want to know what distinguishes Judaism from idolatry, take a look at Avram, who when he was 40 years old recognized, you know, that there was one God, and he would go and he would argue with people in Ur of the Chaldeans, and argue with them, right? And eventually, in the second paragraph, he subdued them with his well-supported contentions. He was a great debater. And, you know, when you do this kind of thing, the king's going to get word of it. So the king tried to put him to death, all right, tried to throw him in the oven, and he survived the fire and came out, you know, miraculously. But his brother wasn't, I mean, confusing stuff, but like, it's all in the Midrash. So he left Ur of the Chaldeans and he went to Haran with his father, by the way. Oh no, maybe not with his father. And then he kept doing the same thing, telling everyone about the one God. And he went from city to city, from government to government, until he had got to Canaan. This is interesting. Instead of God saying, Lech lecha, you go, Avram was just on a mission and ended up in Canaan, according to Rambam. All right, and called in Canaan the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. There's more to this. And when the people who congregated asked him about, his preachments, and he replied by imparting knowledge to each and every one. He was a great teacher. He changed, you know, according to the student. He turned everyone to the path of the true, to the thousands, tens of thousands, the myriads. You know, it's he grew the household, or his household, and apparently he wrote books, even though books didn't exist back then. And he taught Isaac, who then became the headmaster of the school. And Isaac taught Jacob, right? And made Jacob the headmaster of the school. And Jacob gave instruction and supported his flock. So not just his own children, but right, the whole flock. And chose of all of his sons, Levi to be the one who would continue on. And that's how we get to know, by the way, that it's Aaron and Moses and Miriam who are so significant, because they're descended from the Levites when we're in Egypt, right? And Jacob commanded his sons not to interrupt the succession of the sons of Levi to the presidency of the school, so the learning would never be forgotten, right? So human action, creating this sense of community and belief, right? It's expansive. It took Abraham all over the Middle East, and he made sure that there was always someone to teach it. And it's less that his specific progeny were Isaac and Jacob, and then the 12 tribes or even Levi, and more that those are telling us who the teachers were for everybody else. Fascinating, right? And by the way, Abraham had plenty of other kids when he remarried, and less clear if he remarried Hagar or she changed, and she changed her name, or if he married somebody new, but all that's out there. Okay, so we have, on the one hand, Avram is gathering people around him. On the other hand, he's doing it through a belief system and arguments, right? And so then that begs the question, in the same way that Avram was able to do that, and right, can Zionists, be they Israeli Zionists or diaspora Zionists, right, create the same kind of shared belief? Can we create community? And if we are, it's got to be both about the safety of the Jewish people physically, and right, Jewish values, the being and becoming from all the way in week 2. And this is the tricky part for us, because right, it's not just that we are, believers in the one God and part of an extended family, not just birth but extended. But we're also given this mission that like God rescued us from Egypt, here in the second highlight, right? V'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim b'goy kadosh. We're going to be, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So all of us are part of this Levite project. And then in the prophets, it gets even stronger, right? We were formed in the womb, or Isaiah was, right? So like this goes back to our genes and our heritage. We were kind of born into this family, and God never meant for it to be just family. It's too little that you should be my servant, right? And by servant, it's eved, avodah means prayer. So it's like there's a lot of wordplay here. Venaticha un taticha laor goyim. But we're also supposed to be, above and beyond that, a light to the nations. So no answer yet, but potentially we go from this idea of family as being crucial in what we're born into, but we add to our family story that it's not exclusive, and we're supposed to also be special. And so again, taking care of our family of origin, safety first, and being a light to the nations, we have to kind of create some sort of shared belief around. Can we do that? No answers yet. But are you following me so far? Okay. And that becomes now in the 21st century a particular challenge, right? Because it's not clear that unites Israeli Jews and North American Jews, right? Because Israeli Jews feel in ways that North American Jews typically don't give credit for, and we talked about this a little bit last week. What it means to live with the existential threat of Iran, of Hezbollah, of Hamas, right, changes your calculation, right? It doesn't mean that you want the Netanyahu government to do everything the Netanyahu government does, but it does mean that like the sort of peace movement in Israel is 10% of the population, whereas, right, the vast majority are sort of center right because of what is perceived as an existential threat. And that's without getting into any of the sort of like politics of fear or messaging that comes out of the government in terms of the threat. To acknowledge that the perception may not match the reality, but that's the feeling, right? Whereas in America, we want the Israel we can look up to. We want like it to be the moral exemplar. And I don't know about you, but like we've teased some of this out. I know for me, like hearing the stories of the pioneers of Israel and the way kibbutzim were meant to be like ideal societies, and it worked for a long time. Like Israel was this like, we're in America right now, like this week, we're waiting to watch to see if Amazon workers are going to unionize, right? And like, for the Zionists, it was like, the unions are going to be the government, like the Marxism, like on steroids, like but this is supposed to be the fulfillment of like actual sort of, we'll call them utopian ideals, but they were very practical in their implications. And again, it worked for a long time. So we were like, we started with an Israel that may have done some questionable things in terms of its neighbors in the early years, right? But was also accomplishing sort of high moral values. And today, like our version of high moral values is startup nation, like, or vaccinating most of the population, you know, most of the citizen population. It's not the same thing, right? So we want to be Or L'Goyim, and we still have to appreciate safety. And it doesn't mean that Israelis don't want to be Or L'Goyim. They actually love when their country is doing really well. And sometimes they take it for granted that it could be, you know, a kind of moral voice or the only democracy in the Middle East and all those kinds of things. So it's just, you know, where we put all these priorities. All right, so yeah. Questions on this possibility of shared believers? No? Okay. So let's look at partnership a little more thickly than just, you know, a transactional relationship. And again, this I get from Rabbi Lauren Birkin, who's the director, senior vice president of rabbinic something. I don't know. She's got a fancy title at Hartman. She's wondering if partnership can be less about investment and more about mutual tikkun. If we take that loving reproof and put it into a different kind of practice, so that maybe we don't start as family, but maybe we become family. And so she suggests that we have mutual responsibility, yes, but then she's going to up it with covenantal mutuality. All right, so it's on a different level that makes it a little less like a zero-sum game where we're like, which partner is going to have more control and whose vision is going to dominate the company of the Jewish people. And so instead of it being about family or partnership, it's going to be about something new. And here's where she gets some of this from. She's from David Hartman, Doniel's father, and a great rabbi. He notes, and there's a whole lot of like beautiful source explanation we talked about a little bit in terms of like arguing the very fact that God felt like God had to ask Avram or tell Avram about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah was suggestive of a different kind of relationship. And what does Avram do? He doesn't just say like, oh, okay, go ahead, destroy it. Avram says like, stop. What if they're 50? No, what if they're 20? What if they're 10? Right? And that relationship is defining of a different kind of partnership, right? Again, not necessarily even of equals, right? Because it's God and Abraham. So what Hartman sees in that is that God goes from using divine rage. Let me see if I can get this to give me the here. Instead of divine rage, okay, and the unilateral use of power, like with Noach, God admits that as Lord of creation, God cannot become the Lord of history unless human beings become responsible and accountable. It can't be a process of like destroying everything and starting over, because then there's no history. It's like, it's just fits and starts. So God's presence in the world becomes conditional on human beings sharing the burden of history. And this is what he calls covenantal mutuality, right? The covenant reflects the divine decision to share responsibility for history with human beings. So God's going to kind of give us space, right? And what if North America gave Israel some space? And what if Israel gave North America some space? For Jews in each place, right, to kind of play their functional role as part of what Jewish peoplehood might become. Yeah. So here is a version of that. I'm going to skip some of these paragraphs. So coming out of Pirkei Avot, early on in Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 6, Yoshua ben Parachia says, make for yourself a teacher, acquire a friend, and judge every person on the scale of merit. Aseh lecha rav, keneh lecha chaver, v'haveh din et kol adam l'chafsku. So you're gonna, like, do these three different things. What does it mean, according to Rambam and Maimonides, to acquire a friend? And he says there are three kinds of friends. There's a friend of utility, a chaver toelet, a friend of comfort, a chaver nachat, and then a friend who's like ma'ala, who's of a higher purpose. Okay, so utility is probably like two business partners. A chaver of comfort is like someone you trust, and you rely on that trust up to a certain point, right? But for a higher purpose is where, down here, where both desire and intend the same purpose, and that is good. This is that shared believers model, right? Each will desire and draw strength from his or her friend as good comes from to both of them. And this type of chaver, the Mishnah commanded us, is what the Mishnah wants us to acquire. Comradeship between a teacher and his or her disciple. And sorry, my screen is being blocked by, or between a disciple and her teacher. So interesting. It's not that, make yourself a teacher or make for yourself a teacher is the only way you learn. You're supposed to, right, have a teacher-disciple friendship also, right? Your friend, your chaver, is supposed to be someone who kind of guides you in some way, and it goes both directions. So traditionally, this is generally speaking what we would call a chavruta. So like on certain matters, one of you might know more than the other, but by studying together, you mutually enrich each other's learning. Right? It doesn't have to be so much that one is actually the teacher and one is the student. And by the way, I just taught to a bunch of conservative rabbis a text from the Talmud in which it's very clear that like what it means to be a good teacher of a student who in theory is like kind of below you and kind of some kind of hierarchy is to give them the opportunity to rise up and to be on level with you. And the way you do that is by lowering yourself as the teacher, right? And giving an opportunity for the student to teach, particularly what you taught them. And in that way to enrich, the relationship and the learning. So much so, right, that when we go back to that idea of rebuke, right, if you rebuke a wise man, he will love you, right? Again, you come to someone respectfully, maybe humbly, and you say like, I don't understand what you're doing. It seems wrong to me. You give them a chance to teach you. If they're wise, they'll be like, that was so generous of you, to kind of say like that whatever I'm doing affects you, even if it wasn't directed at you. And that will lead to love, and that leads to peace, right? And so it was that Abraham did this with Avimelech, and only by rebuke, right, do we actually get not just love but also peace. Questions at this point? No? Okay. So where are we? So to kind of put a little bit more of like a frame on this friendship paradigm, this is like family and shared belief being put together into a different kind of friendship, right? The high level, the ma'ala, chaver ma'ala, that there's trust and confidence, there's acceptance, there's love, I would add. You have shared passion. You're both like, it's about the Jewish people, it's about Israel, it's whatever, the being Or Lagoyim. There's mutual dependence, right? You learn from each other, right? And it's based on this word of chavruta, which has chaver, but it's about the pairing. It's about kind of balancing that pairing. And then the question really becomes like, okay, does that help us with reality today? So I'm not gonna throw up our old slides of Brandeis and Beethoven yet, but I'm going to ask you, where do you think this gets us?
Well, one issue, of course, is talking about Israel as a whole, but of course, just as we're split right, left, they're split right, left.
Yes.
So it becomes more complicated. It's not just a few folks in the family. or if you want to keep that model, it's a few folks in the family, but you got two over here and two over there. Can you deal with both halves in the same way?
Can you deal with both halves in the same way? I mean, I think, I don't know about that last piece, but the bigger point about like Israel also being diverse is important, right? So in the same way that we left at the end of last week saying, is America too divided? Are we too right, left in America, let alone the Jewish community, to be able to, align ourselves with Israel? Like Israel also has right and left. It may be in many ways less pronounced, but it's still there. That's why there's a fourth election, right? So how do we, with whom would we chavruta, and who are we rebuking in a loving way? Like, are we rebuking the left or the right? And will it be received by each of those pieces, appropriately? You're asking very much like a key question. And Neil, your reactions.
Well, I lost my, what I'm trying to deal with is how does one, just as an individual, deal with getting into a conversation to either affirm, rebuke, put forward your concerns one way or the other, or compliments one way or the other. As individual, between individuals, as opposed to just writing a screed to put in the paper that
Right.
May satisfy you, but may not have the impact you want. I mean, to me, these kinds of conversations that you're talking about can only come about as we are doing here, face to face and individual, so that everything will have a nuance to it that we can clear up. We see body language, we understand there. The love is there, person to person, or even person to state, but the rebuke, if you will, is there with respect to specific actions of the person or the state.
Right.
I'm not sure how fleshing out these different kinds of models is going to be all that helpful. I was going to say actually at the very beginning that the way we define Judaism as in a tribal way sort of makes us all family, whether we like it or not.
Yes. So I Neil, absolutely, I hear you. And actually, when I said at the very beginning, like I have an idea for something we might study going forward, and we'll see who else might be interested, is very much to get into that one-on-one. What does the Jewish tradition have to say about making that a productive experience, particularly with someone you disagree with? These texts on loving rebuke, like there are many more. And it's not necessarily about always rebuking somebody so much as like, understanding how to disagree. And I guess in the context of this class, right, over the many weeks that we've had together, the question for me, and that I'm trying to tease at today, is like, I mean, I said we're family, right? So how can we teach what it means to be family in a way that allows us to know that, like, I can't stand being around you and what the things you say, but you're my family and that's forever, right? Because like there's very little of that right now. And there's more of the like, I can't stand you, and very little of the like, and we're family. And again, in the context of family, how can we say like, okay, not only do I have like such deep trouble with the things you say, why are you saying them? And can I ask that in a way that's productive? Again, we might need some of that one-on-one training with an individual, but if we could start with that we are family and a commitment to that, which is less clear to many, particularly as the dominant conversation in Jewish institutional life, even just this past week. Matthew Bronfman, so Edgar's son, who's now like a major, like still plenty of money going out there, basically said intermarriage is what keeps him up at night. And like every family and Jewish institution that's worked so hard to make intermarried families feel welcome, and the non-Jewish parent who does more to get the kid to Hebrew school than the Jewish parent, like it just set that whole conversation back, right? So if that's the conversation at the national level or the world institutional level, it's going to be a lot harder to talk about like, yes, like we're all in this together, because there's a lot of like, the assumption is Jews are leaving in droves instead of Jews are expressing themselves differently. So how can we say to Jews expressing themselves differently, there's something of value here for you, and I care about you. And to Jews who are so adamant about their Judaism that it's almost hyper nationalist, I'm not going to say ultra nationalist, right? To say like, I love you too. How do we make that all about family? Maybe less about talking about family and more about creating shared belief through partnership, which is to say, I'm going to kind of back this up into 3 different levels. Okay. So what I'm positing here, and maybe I'll change all the slides at the end here to reflect it all, or put one in. It feels to me like the Hartman Institute, at least, and I buy into it, so just, forgive me, thinks that if we could sit at the table as partners, even on an institutional or kind of world Jewry level, and argue productively and learn from each other, listen and learn, right? Then that covenantal mutuality will come to embody a shared belief in the importance of having that dialogue, right? So it's less about Zionism, what Zionism looks like, and more about that the Jewish people need to keep talking to each other. And if we can keep talking to each other, then we're going to recognize our family bonds. So it kind of builds up from making the partnership model more robust into an expression of a shared belief that may not actually be about like a Jewish state, and much more about a Jewish people, wherever we may be. And by doing so, we generate a new version of family that has rebuke within it, right? And love, right? And so the rebuke that creates love, and again, according to the rabbis, and therefore peace. That was like my mini sermon. Might it work? Sid, go ahead.
Now, I have a question that's been bothering me all week that relevant in the larger sense, but not specifically. And it has to do with what happened, the Supreme Court decision in Israel.
Yes.
And then, but what I got confused is that it had to do with conversions within Israel, and that conversions outside of Israel have always been accepted. But at the same time, a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure saw this, there was the Kulanu organization talked about the Jews in Uganda, which is a community that I'm actually familiar with, and how they were denied the idea of that they could not make Aliyah. And I know that they were a few years ago officially converted, although they converted.
Conservative rabbi, yes.
Yeah. In fact, I think one of the rabbis on the team was a rabbi from Rochester, from another shul. not. But anyway, so I don't understand if what was going on there, and I probably should have done some more reading. But if the law of return has always been, if you're outside of Israel and you're converted by a conservative, it's okay, then why aren't these Jews in Uganda allowed to make Aliyah? And then I thought, oh, this Supreme Court decision, that's great. That solves their problem. But then I read, no, it only has to do with conversions within the state. And these Ugandan Jews were converted not in the state. So
Yeah.
the ones who wanted to become citizens were right there. I don't know, I guess.
So I'll be honest and tell you that I don't know about the distinction between in the state of Israel versus outside of the state of Israel. I just got the through conservative and reform conversion. What I got from the hubbub was that nothing in the Supreme Court decision changed the law of return. And yet, Likud ran a political ad to suggest that the law of return was being undermined by a bunch of non-Orthodox rabbis sending people to Israel who weren't really Jewish. So I don't know how to put this exactly. For the law of return, I have done the paperwork to say that, proper conversion was done. And because I'm a conservative Jew, I have to I can't just say yeah, I converted them. That's not enough. I can't just sign a letter. I have to have the document with the Beit Din, with the 3 rabbis who questioned the convert and who witnessed the immersion in a mikvah. And if it's a man who also had, hatafat dam brit or circumcision. Yeah. So that extra paperwork has to go to say that look, we did the halachic, the Jewish law minimal requirements for this person to be a Jew. And then no, the rabbanut in Israel won't accept that person for marriage, right? They might make that person convert again in Israel, but the state of the government would let that person in under the law of return. So that didn't change, right? So much as the Supreme Court was basically saying duh, right? And I think that's the piece about the inside Israel, right? Because if you convert in Israel with someone who's not, if you convert in Israel with a conservative or reform rabbi, you're probably already a citizen. And if you're not, I guess that's what the question the court answered, now that I think about it, is that, you could qualify for the law of return. Again, the rabbanut might not let you get married without doing an Orthodox conversion. But for citizenship purposes, that would be sufficient. The same way it's been for decades coming from America or other places in the world. And I don't know why Uganda was singled out as inappropriate or not meeting the standard. I think it has to do with the whole community, and maybe also racism, but just, without getting into the racist piece that it's hard to say about, if I understood the way that the government reacted and the rabbanut reacted, it was about the group as opposed to individuals. But again, the hubbub is really that Likud, because it's election season again, put out this ad saying the law of return is it's very reminiscent of what Trump also said last week about Biden letting in all the criminals at the border, right? And Texas, the governor, forget about Trump. The governor of Texas said that, the Biden policy is going to let Mexicans and other immigrants with COVID, give Texans COVID. No, right? And that's the same in Israel. Literally, no, it doesn't change anything except for a very small group of people being able to right? But the political version is all hell is breaking loose. Yeah, was that enough to like give you morsels to chew on until you can research the rest?
Yeah.
Other questions or issues, plaguing you, or that maybe my chavruta, like a deep partnership that leads to a shared belief in pluralism, getting us to a new kind of family. I posit it as a hypothesis, not as a solution. But if I take this class as a starting point, right, and in the same way my colleague Lauren Birkin added the friendship paradigm, it feels to me, right, we should play with these as well. And next week we're going to get into like, okay, so how do we feel at home here and there? Again, not necessarily solving problems, but appreciating the notion of what it might mean for Israelis to be at home in Israel and for North American Jews to be at home in North America. Although I hope it's a little bit more robust than that. There are no sources. It's just a lecture. No? So let me just throw up here one last piece of this. So in case it generated further dialogue, I brought back Brandeis, this idea that like, Israel should be both family and social justice. Maybe that'll help, or maybe that's the rebuke. And Biton saying like, I need to appreciate all the different ways in which in any given case. And I think, Sid, you were talking, you're like, in Israel, it's not just like one Israeli Jew, and the same thing in America, it's not just one American Jew. So maybe we need to just be more nuanced, to go to Neil's point. And then I just will leave you with this in terms of like keeping you busy between now and next week, is that the interview at the end of Unit 13 is pretty rich. The David Seth Kirshner is a colleague of mine, again in northern New Jersey. He's the one who kind of brought this family model of like closeness and rebuke into kind of relief. The other scholar interviewed speaks mostly in Hebrew, and she has big beefs with parts of Israeli society on the Jewish front, right? But how she feels about Israel is very much kind of within the domain of what we presented here, and their interaction is pretty fascinating. So it's worth the 20 minutes. And then if you're looking for more and maybe solution oriented, Neil doesn't quite get to like the difference between people and groups, but he does actually offer a way to decide what groups to be a part of. It dates back to 2017, so I don't know that I would hold him to this 100%. He might change the percentage now to like 53% instead of 51%. But Yehuda Kurtzer puts out there that sort of like, look, we have to kind of figure out what are our moral imperatives and what are our moral preferences. And he basically says like, if you're on board, or if whoever's going to be at this like march or this protest or whatever, I'm on board with 2/3 of my moral imperatives, like it matches 2/3 of my list, right? And 51% of my moral preferences, then I should be there, right? I have to be willing to give up 1/3 of X and 49% of Y, because I can't live in a bubble or in a shtetl, I guess. So I invite you to read the article. That's the title of the article. So if you want to read it today or tomorrow, Linda Sarsour and American Jewish Politics, you can probably just search for Yehuda Kurtzer and Linda Sarsour and it'll come up. But it will be in the slides linked when Sarah forwards my email to you. All right.
All right.
Thanks, gentlemen. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.